to the second episode of our PJI summer conversation series. I don't know if we're gonna do 3 or 4, but not many more than that. So hopefully you saw edition 1. I think the advertisement for that went out today. It's on our PJI YouTube channel. We have a real treat for you today. We had a treat for you then. We'll have a treat for you next time, but this time, right now, talking to Avery Martens, who is so many adjectives I could use to describe you. Super passionate, super energized, a little bit super tired today. But they're the director for showing up for racial justice in Northeast Ohio, right? So you can read Avery's full bio on the show notes that are attached to this YouTube from today. But I'm just gonna give you a small sample. So I know it says you have a 20-year track record, but there's no way you could be that old unless you started when you were about 12. 20-year track record working as an organizer, project manager, and strategist who builds power with people and communities most vulnerable to structural violence. Ultimately, and this is why we connected, working towards the collective liberation for all people and the planet. Totally down with that. Are you down with that? You're down with that. Well, Avery, thank you for taking time out of your incredibly busy schedule to spend a little bit of time with me and with us. We met a couple months ago, maybe, on Zoom, right? Where everybody meets everybody now. Yeah. But obviously your passion and your skill for the work came through. It comes through the screen. So I've been so fascinated by the work in Ohio, and I've been so interested to talk to you. So thanks.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. So I wanted to start by just really introducing you. Introducing you by talking a little bit about your background. So I always like to know kind of how do people end up where they ended up. And for those who might tweet and Facebook this link, my pronouns, she, hers. Your pronouns?
They, them, theirs.
They, them, theirs. So tag us correctly, people. It's not that. You're welcome. Avery, how did you end up? And then, I know some people might know what SURJ is. Some people might not know what SURJ is. So both of those questions intertwine, sort of what's SURJ and how did you get to SURJ?
Awesome. Well, my path into organizing has been a really interesting one. I actually, I started organizing when I was in high school, and I was that gay kid in the early 2000s that started the Gay Straight Alliance. And I'd been previously someone who experienced a lot of marginalization in my life. I grew up really poor. My family is Jewish. I've been visibly gender nonconforming since I was about 12 years old, and just faced a lot of obstacles. And I came into organizing by someone really supporting me and reaching into my power. And it was really life-changing. And so I started organizing around, in the early 2000s around creating gay straight alliances in high school. And I was the first person in my family to go to college. And I show up in college and I'm like, all right, I am down. I am queer.
Ohio, by the way, are you in Ohio this whole time?
Yeah.
Gosh.
Grew up, I was born in Cleveland, but I grew up in Southwest Ohio in a very rural area. And
we're I'm from Ohio. There's always lots of people from Ohio who seem to be in the work. So we got to stay together.
It's so true. It's so true. So true. There's so many folks from Ohio. And so I was, first person in my family to go to college, was really excited. I actually went to Antioch College, which has this really radical history of community engagement, community organizing. Coretta Scott King is a famous alumni from Antioch. It was just a perfect fit.
Yeah.
And I show up and I'm like, I am so down. I have experienced, deep levels of poverty. I'm gender nonconforming. My family is Jewish, and I get what it means to struggle. And so I continued doing organizing around issues around a lot of issues actually. And I quickly was called in some really loving and powerful ways by organizers who let me know that I had a big blind spot around my whiteness and my racism. and what it means to be someone who does hold multiple oppressed identities, but also holds dominant identities. And I had this blind spot, just a complete, lack of awareness around what structural racism was, what internalized white superiority was, just how whiteness impacted my work. And I was really fortunate where organizers of color on Antioch's campus lovingly called me in, and the white allies on campus would, the older students would come to my dorm room, drop off a book about Paul Kivel, from Paul Kivel about addressing whiteness and white supremacy and doing anti-racism work, and they would kind of give me homework and then come back and talk through the readings together, and really just did the work of helping me understand the things that I was missing, and the negative the negative impact that that those missing pieces were having on the work I was doing and the community I was a part of.
19 at the time, 18, 19, 20. This is your college experience. Wow.
Yeah. And I feel so deeply I'm so grateful for that kind of intervention, because it helped me to become a much better organizer. It really was a gift. When folks are pointing out a shortcoming or a thing that you're not aware of, oftentimes that's actually coming from a deep place of love, if you don't, what people basically said to me was, we think you could be a phenomenal organizer, but you're not there yet. And this is how we can help you to actually match your intention with your impact.
So great.
It really was. And it just changed my life. It changed the way that I approached organizing. It helped me understand, power analysis and systems analysis in a way that just has forever changed how I've been organizing. So one of the, I started organizing when I was 15. I got really introduced to anti-racism, politic and organizing at 18. And I just haven't stopped. And so now 35 and have a lot of experience that I just am deeply indebted to. And so I've been organizing for a while. After college, I moved to the San Francisco Bay Area, of course, my queer dream come true, and moved back to Ohio about 6 years ago. And that was the first time that I met.
No one ever says I moved back to Ohio. So a lot of kudos to you for going home, because most of us leave and never go back.
Totally. And there's really good reasons for that. And also there's amazing possibilities for what we can move when we're rooted in our homes.
Yeah, I imagine so. Mm-hmm. And that's where you ran into SURJ.
Yeah. Yep,
so tell folks a little bit about what SURJ is.
Yeah. So SURJ, Showing Up for Racial Justice, is actually a national organization working to undermine white support for white supremacy. So we do this through campaign work, community organizing, mobilizations, direct action, and education. And we really move white people to act as part of multiracial coalitions for justice with passion and accountability. And so SURJ really provides a space to build relationships, skills, and political analysis to act for change. And SURJ was actually the organization on a national level was created about 10 years ago when Obama was elected president. And there was tremendous backlash around the country to having a Black man in such a position of power.
I had no idea it was only 10 years ago.
Right?
Timely.
Yeah.
I mean, we've always been timely, but this is so cool. Okay, keep going. Sorry.
Yeah. No. Please, you can be long-winded, so interject at any point. So yeah, the organization was started by then was the executive director of the Highlander Center, which is a famous training ground in the civil rights movement out of Tennessee. The executive director at the time was an older white woman who's been working doing anti-racism and multiracial organizing for a very long time. She was also the co-founder of Southerners on New Ground, another incredible organization out of the South.
You know them, yeah.
Yeah, they're so good.
Yeah.
And her friends were just what are white people doing in this moment to meet the organizing that's popping up around that's being led by the far right and is overt white supremacist organizing. And she said, yeah, what are we doing? And put out a call. And through that, basically the SURJ network was born. It started as an all volunteer network. We had 15 chapters, and we went on, you know, it was an interesting time to organize around racial justice. In this myth idea of being in a post-racial society, there was a lot of challenging conversations.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And then Trump was elected, and we went from 15 chapters across the country to 195.
Wow. That's a bit of an expansion. Again, still mostly volunteer?
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. I think at this time, maybe there were 2 staff for the entire country. And so we've always been this grassroots, like, movement organization. And something I really appreciate that I've heard the former executive director, Pam McMichael, say is that the revolution will not be funded, but it will take resources. Yeah. And it takes resources to do the work. And so in this tremendous amounts of growth, we've been figuring out a lot about what it looks like to resource this type of work. And in part of that, for those of us here in Ohio, we really recognized that that we needed some kind of coordination around our network for our chapters that were in Ohio, and that we could provide some of that resource and that infrastructure and that support at a statewide level. And so we have this network we call SURJ Ohio, with a couple of key leaders around the state, really trying to invest in our leaders and contribute to leadership development.
Yeah. Okay, sorry, I have like 43 questions, but I'll try to narrow them down. So, and I'm the worst kind of moderator because I also pontificate right before I ask the question. So I go on my own monologue. But that's why it's a summer series. We're super laid back in the summer.
That's right.
I ran into SURJ when starting my own journey a couple of years ago, and folks have heard us talk about that, our both organizational journey, but then understanding it's a deeply personal journey to do as well. You know, some of us have this, and I don't think it's just because I'm Italian, but we sort of have this Christopher Columbus, like, I just found something. I must be the only person who knows this. I need to tell people, and I should start an organization to do it, right? Like, this is how we invented the nonprofit industrial complex, right? We all have the like thing we think is the first time anyone has had the thought. So I realize I'm like literally the first white person to discover anti-Blackness, of course, in my own mind. And so I'm rushing out to sort of say, well, what else should I read? What else should I read? And then one article was like, you know, and there have been champions for Black lives among the white community for several decades, if not hundreds of years, right back. And then you find all this rich history of white people standing up for racial justice, right? Showing up for racial justice. So I was thrilled. And we just happened, I live in the DC area where, you know, when you were 15 chapters, if you needed that kind of camaraderie and colleagueness, right, in this work, only if there were one of those 15 chapters within Drive, right? Now you're 195, there's like 2 or 3 just in the DC area. So really kudos to the whole organization and to the founder for the volunteer network that it is. But I think the thing that I was most impressed by, and I found the hardest to understand until I understood it, was what does it mean to decenter whiteness and center racial justice? Does that mean that as a white person, I should just step out, right? Like leave the work I'm doing if I'm working in the system? Like, really, what do I do? Because it both seems huge, but also culturally, we're not like set up to know what we should do and where we should go. So I really am excited to be able to just share SURJ with our community first and foremost. Not that everybody hasn't heard of it, but in case they hadn't. But I'd love for you to describe sort of, so what is the way in which you mobilize and organize white people, and why is it so important? What does it mean to decenter whiteness, but actually still show up?
Yeah,
that's like that, Avery. Go right ahead.
Yeah, yeah. Oh gosh, yeah. So yeah, the like explaining what is SURJ is some of the like is complicated, right? Because we have these understandings about race and identity that that are just really complicated in the US, and that oftentimes, you know, the way in which communities get pitted against each other is actually really strategic by the folks at the top, right? So like SURJ builds and organizes out of this framework that we call mutual self-interest. And this is really this idea that like racialized capitalism actually serves nobody but the very like 1%, the folks who are at the top. And the communities would actually have the most to gain by dismantling racialized capitalism, white supremacy, you know, the way in which our systems have been founded, actually are pitted against each other strategically to maintain these systems. So there's both this like understanding about how much there is to gain when folks who are actually have more alignment with each other than what we're kind of told.
Right.
And there's like very real like pieces of work for white people to do who are showing up to racial justice that are both about kind of personal transformation and systems transformation. And being part of this culture is like our brains are always marinating in the stew of like toxic white supremacy culture that just impacts who we are and how we are. And so part of SURJ is about that internal self-reflection and that personal work to understand how these systems of domination and oppression actually like show up in the way that we are as people.
Do you do trainings? You guys have coffee time? Like how
do we do it? How do we, yeah. So we have, we do like personal transformation work. One thing that we did in Ohio, for example, is we ran in collaboration with the Catalyst Project out of San Francisco Bay Area, a training program for white social justice organizers and advocates that was over the course of many months to deepen their understanding of racial justice and to develop a skill set that allows them to really center that work in whatever work they're doing. Because racial inequity is like the piece that connects all of the work. And so environmental justice, reproductive justice, like all of it has to do, you got to center racial justice. So that's one example of kind of and it was a cohort style. We had mentors that were paired with activists. There were in session, we met, it was like 4 days over three weekends, 4 days each, training sessions, a whole curriculum that the Catalyst Project created. Speaking of movement mentors, the Catalyst Project's Ann Braden program is modeled after Southern.
I just discovered Ann Braden. Again, one of those like, why didn't somebody tell me this woman was out there? I mean, I have a little, if you really, really read some of her stuff, it's confusing in many ways, but at the time, she must have been seen as, I mean, completely out of step with all the other folks in the South.
Yep. And one of her quotes reminded me of something you were saying earlier too, is that like we have to stop believing we're the only ones, that there's been white folks throughout all of history that have like rebelled against these systems, and we're really not alone. You know, we're not special. Like there are deeply appreciate her.
It's so freeing, actually.
I know, right? Yeah.
You just got to do what you can do while you can do it. So after you train folks, for example, so folks go to a racial equity training or they're in a cohort model over some period of time, what are we hoping? Now you said, well, they go back to their organizations, right? And they bring that space into it, but you must have sort of other volunteers within SURJ who are just sort of like, I hate to call them soccer moms, but people who show up, right? And let's say they go through the same kind of training. What do you want them to do?
Yeah. Well, luckily there's an endless array of work to do. So one of my favorite phrases is get in where you fit in, and that there isn't like the perfect thing or the perfect model. And everyone has access. Like what's really the emphasis, I think, with SURJ that's different than just like kind of racial equity and inclusion trainings is that we're moving the personal transformation is in service of systemic and cultural transformation. And so, you know, we can't just
implicit bias.
Say it again.
Is that it's not just trying to like eradicate implicit bias.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. That Yeah, it's deeply embedded in our systems, and we have a responsibility to act collectively with white folks, actually, and with folks of color, to achieve real change and real transformation in our systems and in our culture. And so, you know, we have a number of ways that folks can plug in and take concrete action. Some of the work that we do, we have a use of force monitoring group where we monitor over 30 police stations and growing in Ohio for their use of force incidences. And then we collect that data and share it with our community partners and come up with like collaborative strategies for how we're going to respond. Or we do, we're very active in community, there's a consent decree in Cleveland. We're very active with the Community Police Commission and are part of a larger community-based accountability group that's figuring out ways to have a police oversight process that is truly has power and truly has teeth. So there's these, like, we have these working groups that steward different projects. And the idea is that you'll take the information through your education and your personal transformation and apply that to being part of larger actions for racial justice.
Like you could stand and make a wall of moms.
Yeah.
In Portland, right? Or the block dads. Talk a little bit about that, and then I want to turn to Ohio. But you know, I noticed here locally during the marches and the uprisings and stuff that there was always a SURJ banner somewhere in the crowd. I could always tell that the folks were around. But there was a lot of discussion, and there have been just a lot of news things about what are you supposed to do as a white person when you stand up to a Black Lives Matter, when you show up to a Black Lives Matter march, right? So can you just remind folks, like, how do you train your folks about what it means to bring their bodies to that kind of work?
That's such a great question. First and foremost, follow Black leadership. So whoever is organizing that rally and that protest is their direction and their leadership that you're following. And like you don't show up as a white person to a rally and start giving unsolicited advice and telling people what to do, because Black people who are organizing and leading, they have more wisdom and experience than we will have, and it is not our place to come in and try to assume some type of leadership in that space. It's just, that's not it. And so a big piece is around just like decentering ourselves and making sure that we're showing up in support of the leadership of folks of color.
You know, sometimes when I say decenter, and people ask me what I think that means, I said, are you a parent or do you have a pet? Because when you are responsible for someone else, like, you decenter yourself, right? So if you have a child and you care about what happens to that child, you also don't sort of continue to parent them well past when they're an adult, right? So as an adult child, I'm decentering myself around my kid because my kid becomes the center, but I'm also not expecting that he needs my advice because he knows his own life, right? And so decentering whiteness isn't about going home. It's not about staying home. It's about showing up and following the directions of other leaders, which isn't necessarily something we're always very good at as white leaders in certain spaces.
That's so true. And then I think the other piece is, like, we have to be willing to put our bodies on the line. And so something that I've seen really effectively happen here in Cleveland is when police are getting aggressive and you can, making an advance towards Black and brown organizers, that white people actually, like, we put our bodies in between the police officers and the organizers of color. And if that's something that you have the mobility or the capacity to do, like, you got to do it. We have to be willing to show up, not just as like bystanders on the sidelines, but like, that's a way of both centering whiteness, of really recognizing what your whiteness is, but centering it in service to organizers of color.
I want to say two things about that. One, I hope that for people who wondered whether or not white people should be showing up for racial justice, what you said about, sort of the folks in power maybe not wanting groups that have a lot in common to bond. The Wall of Moms, it wasn't like they said, oh, the moms are here, we're not going to advance on the moms. There were moms who got hurt. And so if you needed any more clarity about kind of the power dynamic at play here, it's also sad, but and the older gentleman who fell back, you know, who was pushed back and hit his head and bled, that what they're coming for us too, right? They're coming for us. The other thing I want to do is say, not all my analogies work out. So the parenting thing, it sounded really good in my head before I started saying it, but I just want to say this because this is also what it is to show up for racial justice. When you wonder to yourself, oh, should I have said anything about parenting? Because paternalism is a big component of sometimes the white savior syndrome of like, you're showing up and you're going to like help because you're a savior. Not that I'm a mother with a martyr complex, but that's too close to parenting. So that was a crappy analogy. Did you hear it when I said it? Did it occur for you like, oh, I wonder why she's doing a parenting thing right now? Because we don't need more paternalism in this space.
Yeah, I appreciate you just saying that, because I think that it's one of those things where I think the analogy like worked in the sense of, you know, like it was a good example of when you are showing up for someone else, but it's not actually about you, it's about them. And I think that what you're naming about that like paternalism and the white culture that oftentimes shows up is something to be very mindful of, and like comes out in a child analogy. So I feel like the intention was, but I appreciate you just naming that.
Right, but there's
like,
intention and impact, right? And so what we've learned in our work and what I've been learning over the last year is it doesn't actually matter what I intended in my analogy. If the impact on somebody is that it feels like it is experienced as a microaggression, then, or just an example of my own disconnect, right? You got to be able to hear that. You got to be able to catch it. And you also don't have to be perfect. So I made a mistake, right?
Yep.
And it's not 2 days later when I caught myself and said, oh, I wonder what, oh, well, no, I'm sure it was fine. But like now what's aligned with our values, my values, and sort of centering racial equity is like, well, I can't let that go. I don't care we're recording a webinar. Like, I'm not going to leave that in the space between Avery and me, and then I'm going to step on it and step over it and step through it. You heard me say, okay, so I won't belabor the point, but it is actually a great example of like, doesn't mean white people aren't going to continue to put their foot in their mouth, either intentionally or unintentionally. And it's okay to say like, oops, how was that? Did I just like do that? And for someone to say, yeah, you did. And then to just be accountable for the impact.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate there's so many things, you know, I really appreciate you naming this like paternalism and like white supremacy culture. And I'm reminded of Tema Okun's Characteristics of White Supremacy Culture. And it's a really great read because it challenges us a little bit more to think about the harder to name pieces of culture that are actually deeply ingrained and that we kind of like put out and reinforce all the time. And it's like, you know, like this work it's a journey and it's a process, and it's, you know, it's kind of cheesy to say, but it's like really just not a destination. White people, we will never arrive at being anti-racist. And so like we are always going to make mistakes. And I think that it is really important to like own those mistakes, to work through those mistakes, but also not to let them stop you from doing the work, because folks of color don't have the option to like opt out of racial justice work. And white folks really like, this is a lifelong commitment that we just have to make.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for that. We met because one of our teammates, Zaria Davis, who's located in Cincinnati, and who came on board last year, has been our kind of like on the ground community person supporting the work of others across the state, as well as in Hamilton County, which is where she is in Cincinnati. And so substantively, sort of in the bail pretrial space, I'd love to know what SURJ of Northeast Ohio is sort of doing in the corridor around there and around bail and pretrial. But then I'd also like to, just again, for the folks who are watching this, so if you find your local SURJ chapter and they're doing work on bail and pretrial, what does it actually mean for your volunteers? Like, what are they doing in this space? And you may not know or may not have a lot of ongoing stuff. I heard once about court watchers, like some people are doing court watching, so maybe you'll talk a little bit about that. But share with us about what SURJ has got going on in Northeast Ohio around bail.
We're part of the Stop the Inhumanity at the Cuyahoga County Jail Coalition, which is a campaign that's been, was launched at the end of 2018 after there were 8 deaths in our county jail in a matter of a couple of months.
I remember.
Just horrendous conditions. And I do want to note that Cleveland really thinks of itself as like the epicenter of liberalism around Ohio. It's a blue county. Yeah, it's a blue county. You know, Democrats run the show. And just to name the way that like systemic racism is just so deeply embedded in our systems, it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican. Our jail and our prisons and our court systems are just grotesquely stacked against folks of color. So we take an active role in that jail coalition work. There's a bail reform working group that's led by one of our incredible comrades. We have active participation in the bail reform process. And exactly, we have chapters that are doing different types of work. So each chapter around Ohio does similar types of work, but everything is kind of tailored to their local context. And so I know our Greater Dayton chapter has been involved in some court watching, and we've also done some court watching up here as well to actually see how the practices are playing out in the courtrooms, because what you hear is one thing and what you see is a very different thing.
Yeah, let people know about that. So court watching, there's typically a form or some sorts of data that is being collected by the volunteers, right? Because what you're capturing, as you said, is what's actually happening. So what did the prosecutor ask for on bail? What did the defense reply with? What was the discussion? Because the only thing that ever gets recorded is the outcome of that discussion, right?
Yep.
And court watchers bring in an important component of like, yeah, but they got to that answer by this like family circus cartoon route that goes all the way around to here. And it's really vital data. And it is something that white people can do, right? You can go to court, you can get trained by your local SURJ chapter, and you can go and help. It's a really, some of the best data has come from court watching.
Thank you so much. That was such a great explanation. Yeah.
It has to happen. And it's such a great thing for, you know, those are we look like people who belong in those courthouses professionally, you know, often. And so they don't, you know, we don't get hassled in the back of the room.
It looks it looks very different when our SURJ, you know, Northeast Ohio coordinator who's in his 70s and is a white man shows up to court than the potential actually like threat of violence and harm that could come even for Black Lives Matter co-lead doing the exact same thing.
Yeah.
And the jail, you know, the issues on bail are so important, especially when we're talking about the crises in our county jails, because I think it's something like 40% of the people who are sitting in our jail haven't even been convicted of a crime.
Yeah.
And it's become especially important in COVID. You know, it's beyond inhumane in the day-to-day. It's a potential death sentence during COVID. And our jails and prisons in Ohio are 130% capacity. And this issue of bail reform directly relates to, you know, the conditions that are inside the jails, the overcrowding that leads to those conditions, and mass incarceration largely.
Yeah. You have a lot of hope for the future in Ohio, the short-term future. So the work you guys are doing, the work you're doing with Zaria and the other sort of chapters across the state. What's your prognosis for prediction for Ohio?
I do. I have like never felt so excited about living in Ohio and being from Ohio.
No one has ever said that. So tell me why you feel so excited about living in Ohio and about the future. What do you feel so hopeful about?
We have an incredible network of organizers and advocates who are building so deeply with each other, and that we're really, you know, moving at the speed of trust. And to see even in the last couple of years, like the growth that we've had as a network, and the power that we've been able to build and the work that we've been able to move. And we've really been doing it because we've kind of been getting out of our silos and building with each other. And it's just been so beautiful and so powerful to see. I just believe that like we're going to win.
And what does winning look like?
Oh gosh, winning looks like, winning looks like getting people out of jails and prisons in Ohio. winning looks like changing the material conditions of people's like lived realities. Like, you know, SURJ is not just about having the best analogy or the best theory, but it's about actually putting ourselves to work and making good work happen. I just believe that the work that we're doing, especially around prisons and jails in Ohio, is so intersectional and interconnected that I feel like we're going to have some really big wins about transforming aspects of our criminal justice system here, from bail to incarceration rates to, yeah.
Well, I hope I certainly hope that's true, for certain. And I know Azaria hopes that's true. It won't be for lack of trying from a lot of places. So your partner organizations across Ohio, the ACLU, the Bail Project is in a couple locations.
Yeah.
United Way. I mean, you know, when I was with Azaria in Cincinnati, that we were hosted at the United Way to do a community training session. And, you know, every time I say to Azaria, you don't happen to know whatever it is. And she's like, oh yeah, no, I know so-and-so there. So there's really an Ohio, like there's a separate phone tree.
Yep.
For advocates from across the state. And I think, you know, this goes back to something about the personal journey, like learning your own town's racial history was really an important part of my journey. And so I'm from Canton, Ohio. And I mean, I don't think I saw a person of color until, you know, I was in high school. And not much has changed in many cities in Ohio. Small percentage of people of color in the state. Those people of color are typically located in Dayton, Toledo, Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati. You know, it's sort of the cities in Ohio. Everything is super segregated, still very segregated.
Yep.
And yet there's so much at stake in the rural communities all across Ohio who are materially living in similar poverty-stricken conditions, right? A lot of, Ohio's a great example of a state where a lot of industry left.
Yep.
And the economy is always on the brink.
Yep.
And you have more in common with people who are also maybe one paycheck away from losing everything than you do with whoever Ohio's version of the Kardashians are.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So do you believe that the political forthcoming November, it's going to be elections. I know there's a lot of debate about voter registration and mail-in ballots. And, you know, part of what people obviously know is that local elections matter almost more than the presidential election. So you have county electeds, you have sheriffs, you have prosecutors running for office across the state. Are you hopeful for some sweeps?
I'm super hopeful for the local elections. Yeah, absolutely. Like there are some incredible candidates. Shout out to Charmaine McGuffey in Hamilton County, who's running for the sheriff, who is such a stark contrast to the law and order Jim Neal, who's there currently. I think that there's potential for some really exciting wins on the local level this fall.
Now I'm gonna have to put a disclaimer, you know, because we're a non-lobbying organization.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Great. Listen, I'm glad there are good candidates. I'm glad there are candidates that you and the others really believe, you know, have a shot of sort of joining the chorus and leveraging the power from the position that they hold to really listen to the community. I think that's one thing I appreciate about white people in this work is that we often have the connections and relationships to people in power that we can leverage to open doors for other people to come in and go have the conversations that need to be had, and really bring the demands of really the vast majority of Ohioans who all want a better quality of life. Here's my parting conversation with you. So, and this is sort of a funny one because I asked you if I could ask you this, so you didn't say no. When I joined my HOA last year, the other several people involved in the HOA were also people in the LGBTQIA plus sign. Mm-hmm. And it was like the third or fourth HOA that one of the other guys had been on, and he's like, I really do think that gay people are drawn to running homeowners associations. Like there are just collections where it's like,
Okay,
so
it's like
many-
HOA.
oh, you didn't know what it, yes.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
Homeowners association, right? I've done so much work in social justice. I often pass this straight because I'm the old-fashioned B in bisexual. And there are so many people who have experienced this is my theory, tell me what you think. There are so many people who have at least a taste of what it is to not be in the mainstream, the normative, that the understanding of oppression, we may or may not experience it in the same degree, but the recognition that it is a real thing and it is the water some people are swimming in just seems like maybe that's why we're drawn to the work. And maybe it's why it's easier for us to see it as well. But I'm looking forward to your thoughts on that as a queer, non-gender conforming, right? Yes, non-gender.
Yeah.
Is that the order of the words is what I wanted to know. Yeah, so what is it about us? What do you think?
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts on that for sure. Like, it's like, I love it. Like SURJ is like 80% queer, you know, like without even intentionally trying to be so, it just is. And I think that there is something to that. I think that there's definitely the piece that you're mentioning about this othering that that provides a commonality. I'm also going to go as far as to say that if you actually like that homophobia is a tool of white supremacy and imperialism, and that, you know, if you look at the like long breadth of human history, queer people have actually been like celebrated and revered longer than they've been oppressed, and that it was really through, like, if you look at all the anti-LGBT laws across the globe, they were put there by colonial rule during processes of colonization. And so I think that there is both this like othering that's experienced, as well as this like actual root of our oppression that's just intrinsically connected. And I also think that there are times where white folks, particularly white queer folks, feel like we aren't racist, because I definitely, when I got, like, for example, when I got to my undergrad, I was like, I understand this, I'm down, like I check all the boxes, you know. And that actually being queer doesn't absolve us of the internalized racial superiority that we get living in this culture, and it doesn't absorb us of the racism that we internalize and then put out into the world, and that there is still significant amounts of harm that happen to people of color in even like LGBTQ, like predominantly white communities. So I think it's super tricky, but I do think that like, yeah, that there is an overrepresentation of queer or LGBTQI plus folks in the movement for Black lives who are white, and I yeah, like think queer people are pretty great.
Yeah, just something I noticed. And you know, I think the other point I'll end on then with you is about intersectionality, right? Because to be any one of the letters of our alphabet, trans, gay, lesbian, and a person of color, and coming from an impoverished, I mean, and female, like when you pile on, the intersectionality is what I have found to be the most compelling part of having different kinds of conversations with people, because even if they aren't, so even if they aren't a person of color, I bring up the other, whatever the othering is of them, right? And say, well, but there's that piece, and you get that. With Jewish folks, it's very similar, right? You can talk about Nazi Germany, and there's a recognition of those things. Intersectionality, why? Tell me why. Tell our viewers why it's like an important thing to really understand.
I am reminded of the Audre Lorde quote about how there's no such thing.
Pulling these off a sheet of paper that you've written.
No.
Never remember quotes.
I know. I'm like, oh, I hope I don't actually mess this up. About how we do not live single issue lives, or we can't have single issue movements because we don't live single issue lives. That no person is just a one thing. Yes. And that if we really want to speak to the complexity of being human, like we have to acknowledge that we're all multiple things.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. Thank you. So that's a wrap for us, Avery. Again, I just want to say thank you so much for taking time out of your incredibly busy schedule to be here with us. And thanks to the folks who are listening or watching. And stay tuned. In about 2 weeks, I don't know who I'm going to talk to, but we're going to have another episode of this in 2 weeks, and you can watch the show notes for ways to stay connected to both SURJ and PJI. And then we'll throw up a few of those references that you mentioned, the Oaken stuff and Ann Braden, and just a little taste for folks to, if they're looking forward to getting started. I really appreciate deeply the work you're doing in Ohio and the partnership that you are in with directly impacted communities leading this work. Anything you want to say as a farewell?
Just thanks so much for having me on here, and thank you so much for the work that you do.
Thanks. You're welcome. Okay. All right, everybody. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye.